All right, let me show you just a 2-minute clip that shows one of these patients.
Unlike Graham, Peggy Palmer has normal vision.
She's not bad.
She should be able to copy this star easily.
I'll never get this star. Hopeless at this.
But something odd is happening. One whole side of the star is missing. Peggy has a condition called visual neglect. Although her eyesight is fine, half of her visual world no longer seems to matter. 10 years ago, Peggy suffered a stroke in the parietal lobes of her brain.
The parietal lobes are concerned mainly with creating a three-dimensional representation of the spatial layout of the world, allowing a person to walk around, to navigate, to avoid bumping into things.
Ramachandran walks in a hospital.
When the right parietal is damaged, the patient is unable to deal with the left side of the world.
This condition has fascinated neurologists for more than a century because it reveals not only how the brain shapes the way we perceive space in the present, it even determines the spatial look of our memories. This became apparent when Peggy was asked to draw a daisy from memory.
A man watches Peggy draw.
Right. A daisy it shall be.
For neuropsychologist Peter Halligan, Peggy's drawings reveal exactly what's gone wrong.
It's like a radar system, whereby the actual radar system on the left-hand side is no longer working well. If someone comes in on my left-hand side now, or I hear a sound, my eyes will immediately move to the left-hand side.
Sorry, I have to make a brief pause. Well, he just said that if somebody walks in the room and his eyes go straight towards the person, he's describing, although I think at the time he might not have known it, he's describing exactly the ventral attention network.
Makes me, for evolutionary purposes, very aware of my environment. Because if I wasn't aware of those things, I'd have accidents. I'd get hurt, or I might get eaten by wild animals and whatever. Now, in Peggy's case, she will not attend to those things that we would normally be aware of.
Well, it's covered here, but notice how she's trying to add petals to the daisy. It just, she cannot go any further to her left, and so she's just adding them under.
Peggy thinks she's drawn her daisies right, until it's pointed out to her.
You've noticed that, have you?
Oh dear.
So what Peggy's drawn for us is several nice daisies with the left side missing. Same with this one, and this one. And look at this one, this is a very good example.
I've done it on all of them.
Which means that she's not only neglecting events in the world, but when she conjures up a mental image, she's ignoring the left side of that mental image.
Well, I thought I was going all the way round, you see.
And this shows you that this is not simply a sensory problem, but a problem of consciousness.
And indeed, perhaps the most beautiful demonstration that neglect is indeed not a problem of vision, but a problem of attention, comes from a classic experiment by Biziak and Luzzati, which is dear to my heart because it took place in my hometown. So they did something very, very clever. They asked, so of course they worked in Milan, so many of their patients were from Milan, and they did the following experiment. So what you're seeing pictured here is the Piazza del Duomo, which is the main the main cathedral square in Milan, and you can see sort of here the layout of what it might look like. And here's what they did. So again, this you're seeing an actual sort of an old picture of the square. And here's what they did. They said, imagine yourself. So they're doing this at the clinic. Okay. So they said, imagine yourself at this end of Piazza del Duomo, where there's this prominent statue. Imagine you were just at the steps of the statue. Tell me everything that you would see. You know, close your eyes, imagine it. Tell me anything that you see. And it turns out that when they're placed in these imaginary positions, patients report this. They report, you know, what's in front of them, and they report what's to the right of them. But they ignore entirely what was on the left side. And it makes sense. Remember, neglect results from an injury to the right hemisphere, which then means that they are describing what is in the ipsilesional visual field, so the good visual field, and they're ignoring, as you'd expect, what is in the contralesional visual field. But here's the really clever twist. Right after doing this, they said, okay, very good, thank you. But how about now imagine yourself at the steps of the cathedral looking out. So imagine yourself being right here, now looking this way, essentially looking towards where he was before. What would you see? Turns out exactly the opposite. Now they ignore all the buildings and everything that they described earlier, just a minute ago, but they report everything that was on the other side. And again, of course, because this is now the ipsilateral, the good visual field, and this is now the contralateral, the bad visual field. So very clearly, the whole memory is perfectly intact. Again, this is not a deficit of memory. It's not a deficit of perception. Somehow, they just, for some reason, even though their mental representation is complete, they just can't seem to shine the spotlight of attention on the contralesional side. Now, an interesting question is, okay, the patient cannot allocate any attention to what is in the contralesional side, and they don't seem to have any awareness of what is in the contralesional visual field. But is there truly any information from there that does make it through, even though it's being, from an awareness point of view, entirely ignored? And so this is what Marshall and Halligan addressed many years ago. In fact, I want to show you the actual conversation with a patient. So this was a single patient report. So they would show the patient these two, this drawing. Sometimes this house would be on top and sort of vice versa. But in this case, she is seeing these two drawings. And the doctor asked her, "What do you see?" And she says, "A house." And then, you know, they're showing her this one. And then they point at the other one and say, "Okay, and now, what do you see?" "A house." "Are they the same or do they look different?" "The same." Remember, lesion is on the right side, so she's ignoring the left side of these images. Is anything wrong with either? "Nope, looks good to me." "You know what? Which one would you live in?" "But they're the same." "Come on, just pick one." "I'll pick the top one." And of course, in 9 out of 11 times, she picks the one that is not on fire. And of course, you know, sometimes the one on fire, as I said, would be on the top and sometimes on the bottom. So it's not just that she's biased towards one of these two locations. But this is extremely interesting. As far as her conscious self knows, there's no fire. Those two houses are identical. And it makes sense because she is ignoring what is on the left of the house in both cases. So she's not consciously seeing this. Nonetheless, somehow that information that there's a fire here is in some way still making it through, at least to a degree that when she's forced to guess, you know, to pick one of the two, she seems to be greater than chance picking the one that is not on fire. Okay, so but what is happening exactly, right? What is the deficit? What is the cognitive deficit? Neglect is likely a constellation of different impairments. And presumably, according to the exact geometry of the brain injury, it can lead to sort of different subsets and slightly different expressions of neglect. For example, it could be allocentric versus egocentric. However, there seem to be two main impairments that are part of neglect. Now, one is often referred to as a disengagement impairment. Now, remember the cancellation task, right, where you show a lot of horizontal lines and you say, okay, just mark each line. Patients typically stop right here. Now, an interesting variation of this task is instead of marking the lines, you take an eraser and you actually erase them. So if you do this, the same patient that can only mark half of the lines, in fact, patients seem to be able to end up erasing all of the lines. And see, the idea here is that part of the impairment is the fact that if they get caught on a stimulus, then they're stuck and they can't pull away from that stimulus and refocus elsewhere. So when you do the regular, mark each line task, you start marking the lines and then you're stuck on those lines and you can't shift your attention toward the other side. And see, the same might be true in the case of the clock task. Remember, the typical clock task would look something like this. You give a circle to the patient, and the patient sort of writes down the number and tries to cram them all on this side of the clock. Of course, because this side doesn't exist. Right? So try to cram them all here. It turns out the problem here could actually be that as they start writing the numbers here, then they remain stuck on this side and they can't focus their attention away and shift to the other side. Indeed, if you modify the clock task to give them a new sheet for every number, and you say, okay, now write the number 1, and then you say, and then you give them a different sheet and say, write number 2, and then you give them a different clean sheet, write number 3, they will actually go all around just as shown here. But you have to give them a clean sheet every time. Because if you give them a sheet that has numbers on them, they write the first number, by the time they write the second number, they're now locked into that side and they can't shift their attention to the other hemisphere. Excuse me, to the other visual field. Now that's the first part of this. The second part is typically referred to as ipsilesional hyperorienting. So essentially, the idea is that there probably is a breakdown in the balance of the rivalry between the right and the left hemisphere. Of course, because the damage is in the right hemisphere kind of becomes hypoactive. And now the left hemisphere essentially is unopposed and is pathologically orienting you towards the right. So the right visual, the right parietal cortex cannot sort of oppose the left, and so the left wins, and now you find yourself locked in this perennial, pathological bias to look towards the right. And in fact, this happens whether there is an object in your visual field or not. This is just a bias, a tendency of your brain. Because the equilibrium between the two sides is broken, the left side wins out, the left parietal cortex wins out all the time, and now you're constantly shifted in your attention towards the right. Now, if you put these two things together, the idea is that if you have the first issue alone, if you have a disengagement impairment, then that is what underlies extinction. Right? If you're seeing two objects at the same time, the object that is in the good field will extinguish the object in the bad field. You will essentially, you latch on to the one on the good field, and then you won't be able to shift away and look at the one that is in the other visual field. If there's no other object, you can focus on either side. But if there's an object in the good side, you will latch on to that automatically, and then you won't be able to shift away, to move your attention away to the other side. On the other hand, if you have both 1 and 2, then you probably have neglect. And see, the reason is this. You can think of neglect as you have a pathological bias towards orienting to the right side, to the ipsy lesional side. So first of all, the patient lives in a constant pathological shift towards the right. On top of that, as soon as anything enters the right side, they latch on, they are unable to pull away because of the disengagement impairment, and that keeps them completely focused exclusively on the right side of everything, be it an actual object out there or a mental image. So the idea is that these two cognitive deficits can explain extinction and neglect.